Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the break. So I'm happy that we have Professor Joanna Bryson with us for our first keynote session. Joanna J. Bryson is an academic recognized for her broad experience on intelligence, its nature, and its consequences. She advises governments, transnational agencies, and NGOs globally, particularly in AI policy. Her work has appeared in venues ranging from Reddit to the journal Science. From 2002 to 2019, she was a computer science faculty at the University of Bath. She's also been affiliated with Harvard Psychology, Oxford Anthropology, Mannheim Social Science Research, the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. She's presently the Hertie School Professor. The Hertie School is Professor of Ethics and Technology, which is a new position for her that she took up on the 1st of February 2020. I'm sure Joanna probably does not need an introduction to this crowd, so I think I will give you the floor, Joanna. Thank you.
Thanks. You did a great job, but I hate to correct you, but one minor thing is that I did not get to choose what my title was. So they did create the position, and then I just happened to fill it. So I had to apply. But anyway, other than that, yes, absolutely. Hi, nice to meet you guys. I wish I could see you. Please do, I have the participant thing up, so if you can make gestures so I know you're there, that's great. I don't know if this is one of those things where you can tell me if I'm going too fast or too slow or anything, but feel free. And also I have the chat thing, so I can see if you want to chat. Okay, that's great. Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. I've got the chat thing up now. Brilliant. Okay, so let's get going. As usual, if you've seen me talk before, I've got way too many slides, right? Because this is an entire, I assume you know that this summer school where we're all happily together in Cyprus and it's warm is about fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And of course, everyone, when we think about this right now, we think, well, this is what's really important, right? This, right? I don't know. Have you guys already been talking about this today? Yes? No? No? No, it hasn't come up. Okay. So there's a big question. Is this level of social disruption? Oh, somebody was talking about it today. Okay. There's a big question, which is whether this has anything to do with AI. And so now this is a little tricky. I apologize for this. This is the, whoa. Oh, of course. I'm going to have to turn off the sound.
We have an army. Okay, as a soldier and as a general, as a retired general, we have an army of digital soldiers. What we are now, what I call them, because this was an insurgency, folks. This was run like an insurgency. This was irregular warfare at its finest in politics, and that story will continue to be told here. But we have what we call citizen journalists. Okay, because the journalists that we have in our media did a disservice to themselves, actually more than they did to this country. They did a disservice to themselves because they displayed an arrogance that is unprecedented. And so the American people decided to take over the idea of information. They took over the idea of information, and they did it through social media.
All right. So did you guys hear that? I can no longer see you anymore. Is that, no. Yay, okay, good, okay. All right, so here we are. I used to use this title not for this talk, but rather for this other talk about, I think probably somebody else will probably tell you about this. I'm not talking about it much today, but the fact that we discovered that the same kind of artificial intelligence that you use in order to do Google search to get basic fundamental semantics returns the same biases that people have in the implicit association test, so our implicit biases. And then once we had that in AI, we were able to show that not only were those biases things that were both in humans and in machines, but also they reflected reality. So if you look at this right-hand graph, what's going on there is that the dots are representing words. They're words that are jobs. And so the y-axis is the evil, sexist, heavy implicit bias word embeddings, the AI system that is reflecting human biases. And the x-axis is the actual proportion of workers in those jobs that have women, so that the sexist word embeddings thought things were more male if they actually did have more males doing those jobs. Okay, so what this means, some people are saying, oh, well, that means that you've proved prejudice is true, but that's not really thinking about it clearly. The idea here is that our implicit behavior is not our ideal. Rather, the whole point of having consciousness is that we choose new ideals, and we say that's what we want our society to be like. We want women to be doctors. We want women to be programmers. We want men to be nurses. We want everyone to be able to have a full range of job choices. And so that's an ideal. It's not the current reality. And machine learning based on existing reality is going to reflect, as in any kind of learning, human learning and machine learning, both are reflecting on the past. So that was why I had that title, that there is no AI ethics. But I think we're going to take that a little further in this lecture, and I'm sorry that I'm started a little slow there, because this is a new talk for me. Although there's some old slides, there's some new slides, so I'm excited to communicate about this kind of thing. Again, I'm assuming since you're summer school, I'm not going to go into too much about, although I do have like a simpler, this is like a 19th century definition. I hate it when people get up and say, oh, we don't even know. I hope nobody's done this already. We don't even know what intelligence is. Of course, we can look at a dictionary and see what intelligence is. And the way words work is that you choose a meaning for the present, like it says here, definitions for right now. You choose a definition. This is a 19th century definition that was used in order to make it easy to study animals and to say which animals are more intelligent, right? It's just saying you're trying to be able to, you're judging you're more intelligent if you're more able to generate the correct, appropriate action to the current context. Okay, that's it. It's very simple. And the interesting thing, the reason I love this definition, besides that it was what I was taught as a psychology major as an undergraduate and doing my master's in artificial intelligence, that was at Chicago and at Edinburgh, right? So two different continents, I was told the same definition. But not only that, it makes it clear that intelligence is a form of computation. It's a transformation of information, right? That means it's computation. Computation is a physical process. It takes time, it takes space, it takes energy. It's not something that happens by magic. It's not an abstraction. It's not perfect. It's not eternal, right? It's a physical process in the real world. And so I love grounding intelligence that way. So some people say, well, that's not what I meant. When I talked about something intelligent, I'm talking about it, being like, basically they mean human. We have a word for human, it's human, okay? But anyway, we also have a word agent. Sometimes they think they mean agent, but there's lots of definitions for agent again. And by the most basic one is that it's a vector for change. There's chemical agents. The thing you really care about if you're worried about morality is you worry about moral agents. You're like, who is it in a society is responsible for their actions? Now, again, notice I said in a society. The thing is that you have some societies that think that you're not responsible until you're 21. Some think you're responsible when you're 12. How old do you have to be to consent to sex? How old do you have to be able to get married? How old do you have to be able to fight in a war? We're looking to create global consensus around these things, but we don't. Even within nations, we don't always have consensus on these things. Some countries, some populations believe you are not an adult unless you're A, male, and B, your father has died, right? Nothing to do with your own age, just like you're the one who's responsible at this point, okay? So it's massive variation by society. The other half of morality, it's not only about agency, it's also about patiency, okay? So you could basically think of ethics as being about who's responsible and what are they responsible for, all right? And again, different response, basically all societies think that you should keep babies alive, and that's about it. There's not a whole lot of consensus. There's more consensus than that. But there's not huge amounts of consensus, right? There's, for example, is the environment a moral patient? Are we responsible to take care of the environment? there's some philosophers who think that basically we're only responsible for each other, but then all the other things are consequences of that. Like, so for people to be alive, we have to have air. So, okay, air becomes sort of a secondhand patient. Anyway, so this is what a society is made up of. It's a set of moral agents and patients. And now you can look all the rest of that stuff up in an encyclopedia. This is the thing where people think I'm being weird, but I hope I can convince you of it. Again, at least for the next hour, when I'm talking about ethics, I'm talking about the entire set of behaviors that people bring together to sustain a society, okay? And because, as we just said, that there's all these differences about even who is it that's responsible to do that, then that would indicate that ethics is society specific. Now, people hate that because they want to say that one society is more ethical than another society. And all I'm saying is that you have to frame that, okay? Whose ethics is it by which you're judging that, okay? And I'm not saying that all ethical systems are equally successful. You have some ethical, you know, the Nazis were you know, felt that they were hugely morally, had huge moral obligations, they had huge sets of principles, and they spiked, they had a huge amount of success, and then they utterly collapsed and mostly were wiped out, right? So that's not a very stable set of not a very stable ethics. So we're looking for things that help perpetuate a society for some time into the future. That's something we really care about. I'm going to skip that. So let's talk a little bit about responsibility. Responsibility is a property moral agents of a society assign each other, okay? And now this is another point. So the top part is basic. This is another point that's a little weird to me. I believe that we cannot talk about this except in that peer relationship we just discussed, right? It doesn't make sense to, how are we going to hold accountable something that's massively more powerful than we are? So I think, and I cut out a bunch of stuff about trust because I wasn't going to have time, but trust is similar. It's not about trust. You trust a peer so that you allow, and this is something that sociologists and philosophers believe, that you trust a peer in order to allow them to cheat, basically. So when it's not that, you know, that makes sense. When you're pretty sure they're going to do the right thing, but maybe it's slightly so that you can allow them to do the wrong thing once in a while because it's not worth trying to micromanage, right? So the accountability is a society's capacity to trace responsibility back to whoever is responsible, right? And so, yeah, we shouldn't try to trust large, powerful agencies. Rather, we should construct systems to hold those agencies, or at least their principles, the humans, right? We can only really punish and influence other humans. All of our ways of getting justice have to do with the human condition, that humans don't want to be in jail, like Flynn didn't want to be in jail. And we don't want to lose our money, we don't want to lose our power, we don't want to lose access to our friends and our family, right? So transparency is the means by which accountability is implemented. Transparency is how you know who is accountable. There's other aspects of transparency too, but this is the one I'm most worried about right now. Okay, it isn't an end to itself. So it's great to be transparent, but you could be infinitely transparent, and then that turns out you're not transparent. So, like for example, if you show people tens of millions of lines of code, you could say I'm being fully transparent, but actually you can do that in order to evade regulation, right? You could just dump this huge info dump, and then some poor regulator has to read 10 million lines of code. It's never going to happen, right? So true transparency is about being able to communicate what you've done, that you've done the right thing, and so that people can hold responsible parties to account. Okay. Okay. Autonomy. This is a big deal too. People get very excited about autonomy. And like intelligence, it's mostly about ranking. You never have something that's fully autonomous. You know, humans are autonomous. No, we aren't, right? They think that like AI gets more autonomous as it gets more human-like. No, humans are hugely interdependent on each other, right? So the autonomy is the extent to which any agency, whether it's a single person or a robot or a nation, right? The extent to which it can determine its own goals. So you can lose autonomy with respect to another nation if you're dependent on that nation for food or for water or for, you know, not bombing you, things like that, right? So in international relations, autonomy is very clear, all right? And this comes back to security, all right? Security is your capacity to maintain your autonomy, right? Or another way to think about it is solvency. So if you aren't able to hold the society together, if you aren't able to hold yourself together, then you have a problem. And now, believe it or not, we're finally going to get back to the title of the paper and the abstract I promised you guys, okay? Because the economy is the main means by which we achieve security. We buy it, right? It's a means by which we measure our capacity to perpetuate ourselves into the future. Like, can we have a business? Can we raise a family? Or for a country, you know, are we able to buy enough weapon systems or whatever else that you might need to do? Cybersecurity, right? So here's the outline. How that stuff beforehand was like new stuff because of what's just happening, but also motivation. So I'm going to talk about basically two big pieces of work. The first one is my most recent paper. You can read it. I don't remember if I sent it to you, but it's anyway open access. And that's about economic inequality and political polarization. So I think that's like a hugely important thing. Then I'm going to talk about more, that's at almost the transnational level. Then I'm going to talk much more about the individual human experience and coming back to the future of work. I'm going to briefly, if there's time, which I probably just screwed up, talk about these rumors of an AI Cold War. And then what's more important is I want to come back to what you guys will do. Like, why are we even talking about this? What can an individual do? Okay, so economic inequality. Oh, this is very fuzzy. So look at what these axes are. This is from 2011, but you know, probably hasn't changed too much. The y-axis here is index of health and social problems, going back to that first slide. And the bottom here, the x-axis is the extent of income inequality, all right? And of course, you notice that there's America. And here's Greece. Sorry, Cyprus isn't on it, but you know, this is a continuum, and there's Scandinavia and Japan annoyingly being so nice back down there in the bottom left corner. Okay, so going again to American data, and I apologize. I don't know this as well for the rest of the world, but I do know the British data is very similar. And that's partly because America and Britain were both like enormously wealthy countries in the early 20th century. But nevertheless, globally, there was a problem. You might remember it was called World War I. And again, I don't want to there was huge problems in Africa that we don't usually talk about here. But anyway, in the European and Asian context, let's talk about World War I. Leading up into the 19th century, there was this increasing level of inequality and of political polarization. And these things are correlated. But the data we have here is from the bizarre American practice of banning alcohol consumption in the early 20th century, which is in order to pay for the tax revenue they lost, they created income tax. And so now we know how much money people are bringing in, okay? So probably the real correlation here is with wealth inequality, but income inequality is what we have the numbers on. Okay, so 1913 is when you get the first income tax, and what you see is that when the First World War I comes, you have high inequality, and then you manage it builds back. It gets kind of corrupted by the war, but then it builds back up, and then there's the financial crash of 29. And so inequality, it's like that was enough entropy. So both in the UK and the United States, by that time, they said, okay, this is too much. And basically what happened was the elite signed up with the proletariat. And so that's the dark gray line up there was the inequality I was talking about, the proportion of wealth that was going to just the top 1% of earners. That's the way we measure inequality. The light gray line is polarization as measured by how much do the two parties in the United States cooperate with each other. Now, there's a lot of other measures of polarization and also of identity politics, which the work I'm about to show you actually kind of brings those two together. Those used to be sort of competing theories about what was going on when it gets these periods of high difficulty in governance. But now we're saying, well, actually it's kind of the same. Okay, so the point is that there was a coalition made between the elites, to be fair, of enough, not all, but enough of the wealthy people, plus the people representing the proletariat, so the labor unions, the left-wing party, the Democrats. And then they brought down the political polarization, and then they were able to bring down the inequality, the wealth inequality. It started to bring it down. Then, of course, the war, you have even more distribution, of course, because you're spending a lot of money blowing things up, but also you're paying soldiers. And then things went down kind of flat for a while. And then in 1978, it all launches off again, and we have the situation we're in now. Okay, so what happened? We think that, and this is I'm going to show you a paper that's been published, but this little bit on this slide is still speculation, and that graph there is from like 2017 or 2016. I've forgotten what that's a publication by Voorhees, McCarty, and Shore. But this bullet point is some speculation. We don't know why the inequality increased so much, but we think what changed is technology. So suddenly there's a technology that allows you to have business over a larger area. So you're not just using coal, you're using oil. Oil is a lot easier to ship around. You get fewer winners, right? You have telegraph, you have newspapers, you have rail, you have all these ways by which a successful company can spread out and beat out its competitors. So distance is one of the means by which you keep relative egalitarianness, because you're never going to put the entire world into a single best pub, right? So for pubs, for bars, there's going to always be lots of them, and there's going to be room for different strategies. But for airlines, for oil companies, the competition is over a much larger area, and so when you have fewer winners, suddenly you get this high level of inequality. A lot of people are going around and doing the TED circuit or whatever, saying like, oh, what happened in 1978? How is it that wages stopped following productivity? And notice I just mentioned wages back at the individual level. We'll come back to that again. But one of the things that happened in 78 is wages plateaued, more or less, not exactly plateaued, but they certainly stopped following productivity at the rate that it was accelerating. So what I'd like to do is to point out, look, that wasn't the weird thing. The weird thing was the period where they were coupled. That was a policy strategy, okay? And so, as I mentioned, to come to that policy, at least in the U.S. and the UK, where they were quite wealthy at that time, they were able to do that because they had the resource to do it, and then they had the political will to do it. Actually, Germany had been leading in this. They were doing all kinds of great social strategies. Of course, Russia, goodness, Russia had the revolution, and that had a massive improvement in their stability for a while. But Germany was actually doing quite well, except that they couldn't stabilize their economy after the settlement of World War I. Anyway, incidentally, when we talk about inequality, it turns out that you don't want perfect equality. People are motivated by variation, and just empirically, there's no theory behind this. The best Gini coefficient, which Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1, where 1 means only one person has all the money, and 0 means everybody has the same amount of money. The best Gini coefficient seems to be 0.27, right? So about a quarter, right? So it can be pretty flat, but there's got to be some kind of a gradient that you can follow that indicates that you're doing well, okay? I know I'm talking fast, but this ideas are going to come back at the end again when we're talking about the solutions. All right, so yeah, you have to reward innovation and things. So here's the paper. Since the paper, it says in press, sorry, I didn't fix that slide. But I will, since it is a paper and I'm running late, I'll kind of go quickly through this, and I apologize for that. But the idea was that, so we knew for decades that inequality and polarization were correlated, but nobody knew why. And so this is a new, it's an AI model, agent-based model. But to sneak it into a good journal, you have to call it something else. So I think it's called an individuated numeric model. But anyway, the idea is that we know that you get higher payoffs. There's already empirical evidence that you do well if you have a diverse group. So diversity gives you a higher payoff than polarization, right? A polarized in-group cooperation. Okay, so we're taking that from the literature, and then we made this new jump. We said, but what? So why would anybody ever polarize? Maybe it's because you have a better idea of what's going on. So maybe it's clearer when you work with other people like yourself. There's less, you're more like yourself, so you're not going to come up with lots of good, exciting solutions. but you also have a better idea of what's going to go on. All right, so we're going to get a figure of that. No, it's next slide. Sorry about that. So the outcome is, yeah, that we're right. I'll skip over that. so this is a picture of the outcome, and then I'm sorry, I'll show you the model again. I don't know why I did the slides this way. So looking to the right side of this graph, okay, so the x-axis here is about how good is the environment, okay, and it's a little bit arbitrary, it's very abstracted, right? But the right is very good and the left is very bad, okay. And then what the y-axis is remember that what I said was that we're less sure about how things are going to go, whether we're going to get this payoff. So here we're saying that you know for a fact you'll get a higher payoff if you work with your outgroup, but you don't know if you're going to get a payoff at all. So if you get a payoff, it's higher, but you don't know. Okay. And so what the y-axis is about is how likely is it that the outgroup interaction will work. So the in-group will always work. Okay. But are you going to gamble and go for the outgroup interaction? So in a good environment, we set it up so that basically you could have half the time have the outgroup system interaction fail, and you would be, that would make sense. Okay, so we deliberately made that red-blue line at halfway for the good environment. And so then as we predicted when we were trying to understand why polarization would increase with inequality, what's going on is that as the economy is getting worse, you can't. Now the assumption here is that there's a point where you have that failure where you've lost your security, either that you die if you're just like an animal in nature, right? Or if you are if you're a business, you lose your solvency, you go bankrupt. If you're a household, maybe you lose your home. So there's a point where you really can't risk going that far down. There's just no point to that. And so that's when, even though you would be better off going for the outgroup interaction, just because you have to preserve your solvency, you wind up working more with the in-group. So that little blue bump there in the middle, that's the polarization increasing, okay? And one of the interesting things which we hadn't guessed, although I knew, because I knew there were some results, again, from the empirical results, but is that when you know that your in-group is not going to be enough, remember, you know what the payoff is going to be there. So if it's not going to be enough to keep you alive, so when things get really bad, then you start working with the outgroup again. Now you start gambling. It's called gambling for redemption. So anyway, yeah, I'm sorry that I have the slide in a way, but anyway, you'll see in a minute. I'm going to draw this all out for you again. But you might say, well, what has that got to do with inequality? You just told me about the declining economy, but in the same paper, what we show is that when you have inequality, you have, depending on how you handle your inequality, but just without, just normal inequality, then you get false scarcity. So that even though your economy is doing well, only the people at the top get most of it, and the people at the bottom, so even if the economy is holding still, as inequality goes up, the people at the bottom have less and less and less, right? I hope that makes sense, right? So basically it's the decline in the economy that's driving it, but because of the fear of insolvency, but inequality will do the same thing. Now there's some exceptions, like China and Germany, up until recently, the inequality was raising, but they also spent a lot of money making sure that the poorest were getting better off too, and they didn't have as much social cleavage. Okay, so that's what I just said. It's very seldom that species is exactly equilibrium. Something goes wrong, and you need to be able to handle two different kinds of contexts, right? That was the first thing I was thinking. So if you have opportunities in front of you, then cooperating and taking this high risk works. And if you're in danger, well, then maybe you need to do something else if there's not going to be enough for everyone. So then, yeah, so this is the modeling. As we said, where you getting your money, getting things together comes from cooperative strategies, and the in-group interactions are safe, but not very innovative, so lower reward, lower risk. And there's the average reward here. And then we have the outgroup interactions, which are risky but innovative, right? So the higher reward, higher is to the right, you're getting higher payoff. But but also this greater level of variance, right? So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so all the agents in there's like, this really confused our reviewers. All the agents are exactly the same, except that they're in one group or another. Okay, and so it's not that there's like, you know, minorities and majorities. We didn't do any of that stuff. This is really, really basic. All right, so for every player, they have to choose whether they interact with an in-group or an out-group member. And there's no difference between them. Okay, it's just an arbitrary flag, but that flag determines what the payoff is if they do the interaction. Okay, and so the interaction, as I mentioned, is successful with a fixed probability based on whether it's in group or out group. Okay, and you get better payoff if you interact with the out group, but a lower probability of success. And then all you do, I went on about this at a great length. This is about the fact that there's this cliff that you fall off of when you aren't able to, you know, keep your house or keep your business or not starve, right? So this is this discussion about this nonlinearity. All right, and so yeah, when times are good, you can take a risk, so it makes more sense to do the outgroup interaction. But then there's this period where the outgroup interaction risks you falling off the cliff. And so you go for being polarized, and then when you're really far over and you know you're off the cliff anyway with your in group, then then that little bit of tail of out group interaction suddenly becomes more attractive again, right? That's where the gambling for redemption comes in. Okay, so I already told you this, which is why I was just kind of being surprised about. And what I didn't tell you about, I'm sorry, I've just been I've shown these slides before, and I can't believe they're kind of a mess, because I didn't tell you about how do you decide what to do. It's copying, right? So you look at each other, you look at the other agents, and whoever's doing best. You start out doing different things, and then you look and see who's doing best, and you copy them. And so that's how this all spreads. So it's like cultural evolution. Anyway, so I told you about the assumptions. I told you about the outcome. So I don't think I need to say this again. This is really kind of interesting. How does this change over time? So the way I was just describing it, I should probably have done this as a build. Sorry about that. On the left, so just ignore the graph on the right. Let's look at the graph on the left. So what happens here is that you have this probability of whether or not you're going to work with the out group, which, as I mentioned, is the this is with the in group is up. So the less polarized, the more inclusive is the lines when they're at the bottom, like at the very beginning and the very end, right? And then the purple line is how good is the economy right now, right? So that's the y-axis on the right. So this is one of these evil graphs with two different y-axes, okay? So the black line is working off that the left y-axis, and the purple line is working off the right y-axis. So when you're starting out and there's a good quality environment, then it makes sense everybody's working with the out group. But then as the economy declines or as inequality increases, either way, you go to this very polarized situation. But then when things get really bad, as I mentioned, you're gambling for redemption. So it comes back to everybody is cooperating with the out group, those few who are still around. But then as the economy recovers, then you just run the whole thing in backwards. So that's what happens if you get to dictate that, like, okay, it's my choice and I'm going to go with whoever around me is doing the best thing, okay? But all you have to do is make this into a coordination problem. And now we're going to talk about the graph on the right, okay? If you make this a coordination problem, if it's like you have to realize it's a good idea to work with the outgroup again, and other people have to figure out it's a good idea to work with the outgroup. So the person that you say, hey, do I want to work with you? They have to like not shoot you. They have to say, yeah, okay, I'll work with you. Okay. When you add that little change in, you get into a much worse world. So you go into the polarization and you don't come back out of it. And this is a thing that seems to be more like what the political scientists have observed. So you can be in a situation, you go into a polarized situation for good reason. You have a correct fear that things aren't going well. But then let's say the government fixes it. You know, they redistribute a lot of wealth around your region, they build some new industries. People still hate each other, right? And they don't trust each other until some other big shock changes, then they suddenly get a national perspective again, like an invasion or something like that, or hopefully like a pandemic. Certainly in Germany, the pandemic seems to have increased not only trust in government, but decreased fear of disease. right? Because of, this was true, I don't know if it's still true, that this was true in the fall because there was such a successful response to the pandemic in the spring relative to the other countries around us, but now we're just as bad as everybody else. So we'll see if that sticks. All right, this is not the entire explanation of polarization, of course. There's a problem when you have so few people with so much money, then those donors have a huge impact on the political candidates. So this is where you get these eccentric positions, because the donors are donating huge amounts of money to individual candidates. They need to know those candidates are theirs, and so they force them to say things on television that nobody should say on television, right? And so outrageous beliefs may be being used. Again, this is going off. This is no longer in the paper anymore. This is still stuff we're working on. But there's some papers indicating this might be going on, and so we need to model this next. It also seems to be that it's not necessarily that you're actually losing relative status, but the perception of losing relative status is a big deal. So then when there's these media stories about what's going on, you get this huge spike in polarization. So humans are complicated that way. What we're told to believe does have an impact on us, but there is a feedback cycle about this, right? And notice a lot of people think that these highly polarized people are being very selfish, and it's totally false. They're often investing really heavily, but in a smaller group, right? So that's one thing that's going on. All right. So I want to come back to this graph again and talk about, instead of the unpleasant part, let's talk about the pleasant part down here. Norway is like this go-to example. There we go. It's a go-to example of how not to experience a resource curse. So resource curse is like what happened to Saudi Arabia when they found oil, and a lot of other oil countries experienced massive increase of inequality and horrible autocracy and things. The Norwegians are like, okay, this belongs to the people, and they redistributed, and they've been pretty happy so far, right? You can never be sure. This is Norwegian. I don't know if there's any Norwegians here, but apparently the blue line is the one that says, are you happy to pay taxes? And the Norwegians are like, yeah, taxes make sense to us, okay? And the contrast here is the British. You all know about Brexit, which is a very similar election to the Trump election, including that Cambridge Analytica company. They donated their services to the Leave campaign, completely illegal, found to be doing an illegal thing. But the same people, the Cambridge Analytica people that Flynn was working for, were donating their services that Trump paid $6 million for to the Brexit campaign. But anyway, not only that, why was there even fertile ground for those kinds of messages in the first place was that there'd been this massive increase in inequality in the UK in the 21st century. Just incredible. And the people in London hadn't noticed. It was happening to the people in the north, the people in Wales. So there was this absolute tragedy that the UN had to come and document exactly how poor people were, how insecure they were in terms of food, things like that, right? So it's the same kind of thing. It's a resource curse, but not because of oil. It was because of the financial sector had done the same kind of regulatory capture that was just kept spinning off to help people, which is part of that increasing spiral of inequality and political polarization that we were already talking about. Okay, so how am I doing for time? I want to, let's see. Yeah, not well. Okay, well, let's keep going anyway. You guys, yeah, oops, let me pull out and see if I got any important messages here. Okay, all right, okay, good. All right, so that one's fine. Okay, so but nothing else will be as complicated. That's the only model I got to show you, but there's still a lot of slides. If we make AI software that doubles the efficacy of teachers, that doesn't tell you anything about the future of work. Okay, you could have twice as good as schools or half as many teachers, right? So it's weird, the techno determinists, the people say, oh, AI is going to take all the jobs. No, it could just make the world better, all right? It drives me crazy. Anyway, so that decision is not anything to do with technology. It's political, it's normative, it's philosophical, right? That's a decision about how you want to do these things. But notice, of course, that if you choose to go with 2, then you have fewer people with jobs, maybe. And I'll show you a few slides about now. So this is what, when PCs became cheap enough that they were about the same cost as 6 months' salary for a secretary, then people started saying, if say a secretary quit or something, should I buy a PC and make my remaining secretaries as productive or more productive as they were, or should I hire another secretary again? So it's possible that that you start saying, oh well, you know, with AI we don't need to have as many people with jobs. Maybe you'll get a higher average quality of teachers, possibly. But it seems like when people do take advantage of the economic situations, whether or not it's with AI, to get rid of people, a lot of people, unfortunately, also focus on simpler control problems. So, and that, again, can create fragility. All right. So it might line up also with less diversity, of course, but actually quite a lot of places are so undiverse that you could have fewer people and more diversity. Notice how different this feels if you're, instead of talking about teachers, you're talking about artists. So I did this for a film group here, a film group, I mean like the German Film Artists Association or whatever, you know, so the film group locally. But of course, being German, they're all like indie, it's not like Hollywood, right? And so you have this really interesting question, like if you have lots of AI, okay, you say fewer people's jobs, but what you could actually be saying then is more production companies, you know, and that's kind of what YouTube is, right? The TikTok, you know, like one person is suddenly making movies and they might have millions of people see it, but now they're all competing. Like now millions of people are making millions of movies, right? So it's a fundamental shift in the way we live and how we think and everything else. And that, I think people haven't got their head around that. Otherwise they wouldn't be talking about robots getting all the jobs. What we're changing here is how do you make money? How do you redistribute the wealth that the society creates? Okay, so speaking of what people talk about, this is a graph from somebody in another American, sorry, that was interested in how unions help you keep your wages up, right? And they specifically, what these dots are about is about the kinds of jobs that you would think were fully automatable. So the R is repetitive and the T is tasks, and I forgot what I is, maybe it's index or something. But the black on the top there is the wages for the people that are in unions, and the gray is the people that are not in unions. And this is all very nice, you know, right? Unions, I'm a member of the teaching union of Britain still, even though I'm in Germany now. But for me, as an AI researcher, I look at this graph and say, why is all the wage decline between 1983 and 1995? And the poor, I keep telling this story, but the poor guy says, the author says, oh, we economists have a theory that there hasn't been anything happen in AI really since 1995. And it's like, oh, that is such a bad theory, right? Anyway, he shouldn't have said we as economists, because there's at least one economist, David Autor, who had already said, look, this isn't robots. That was the period where in America, when China was allowed into the WTO, and American workers were competing with China. And actually in Germany, this whole thing happened in the 90s exclusively, not in the 80s. So from like 1990 to 2000, and it wasn't about China, then it was about the wall coming down. So all of a sudden, the East Germans were competing with the West Germans, and Poland was competing with the Germans. And so it was very plausible that the car manufacturing could be moved 40 miles. Poland is 40 miles east of where I'm sitting right now, right? In fact, I'm sitting in former East Germany. So that was what brought down the wages in Germany. So anyway, machines to lower wages, access to people does something like that. Okay, so yeah, sorry, gratuitous. There was this thing where Jeff Hinton, who's a god, I don't want to knock him too much, but he was wrong on something. He said that there was no need to hire radiologists anymore because we have enough, because you can do better with deep learning. But there's actually more radiologists now than there have ever been, because they're more valuable, because they have all this AI making them, so every little hospital has a radiologist now because they're worth it because of the AI, right? So yeah, so David Autor, the guy I just mentioned, great paper from 2015, Why There's Still So Many Jobs. And so one of the examples in his paper is there's actually more bank tellers now than before we had before we had automated teller machines. You guys probably can't even remember that. I do. I remember when they were new things. But what changed is that since the branches became cheaper, every branch, there's more branches. People wanted branches in their house to save them time. So that's what I was just saying about the films too, right? And the interesting thing is that tellers are now a little better paid, but there's fewer branch managers, and they used to be paid really well. So again, going back to this inequality thing, this is the hollowing out of the middle. That it used to be, yeah, the branch managers, they were usually white males. Maybe they were friends of friends, but they tended to be pretty good at what they did, right? And so somebody that was pretty smart was being given more money than the rest of his community, and then that money could be spent on, emergencies, fixing problems, right? Little things like, the tree falls over in the school or something, and maybe before you get the money from the government, this person is able to help. So it's a smoothing out of society and creating of different kinds of problems. Similarly, one of the things that I got this from Luciano Hertie, which was the opposite of what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, it's not true that driverless cars are going to destroy the world, because actually there aren't enough drivers now, right? But that's because nobody wants to drive. Being a truck driver now is literally 50% as well paid as it was in the 70s, all right? So back in the 50s and 60s, if you were a driver, you were an enormous individual, again, probably male, but you were a strong person that was able to steer the car. Now, power steering, by that definition of intelligence I gave you a while ago, power steering is already a kind of intelligence. It's enhancing the human's abilities, right? Opposite global positioning, you don't have to read maps anymore, and Excel instead of having to really do the complicated bookkeeping yourself. So there's more drivers, lower wages, right? So how in the first place did white uneducated US American men get such high wages, right? Why all these things are coming down, what's going on? So this is again my future work, rather than future of work, but I think what's going on looking at all these pieces was that the instability that people were experiencing, the difficulties to govern in the late 19th century, were blamed on Marx. They said, oh, this guy invented this terrible idea, right? And they didn't realize that when they were doing more redistribution, they were addressing inequality. They more thought that they were placating the working masses, right? So when they did the redistribution, obviously the Russians, as I said, got there first, and the Russians had this economy that was rocketing from feudalism, from nowhere, right? But it was rocketing up. And everybody thought, what if Marx is right? What if communism is more efficient? And we have to ask that question again with China right now. So anyway, it's another story I don't have time for. The point is that, so they decided the people that were likely dangerous as these white young men, most likely to cause revolutions, and so they gave them work, right? They had them build roads, bridges, all kinds of useful things. And then in the 1970s, the Soviet economy plateaus well below the American economy. So it had been rocketing, and it hits its level of inefficiency where the planned economies weren't able to hold it up anymore. And the people just stop, right? They stop doing the redistribution. And I think it's not only that, so this is about, it's an interesting book about, and this is the really new thing I haven't talked about before. This is about a plant. They had a big union factory, and that factory has just moved somewhere else. Like who needs to pay people that much, right? So they took it away and moved it to another state that didn't have as strong of unions, and the entire town's structure collapses. So the wages, and I actually think that some of this hollowing out of the middle that people talk about makes no sense, that we should still be able to have that gradient. We should still be able to compete with each other and be motivated to do our work. We just haven't found a good criteria. Whereas if you read this Janesville thing, because there's this one factory that's paying these ridiculously high wages, all the other factories that serve it are scrambling to get, like the high school kids are all trying to get into the one that pays the most, and they all know the tiers that goes down, the tiers of wages. And so I think that one of the things we could do to address the current situation we're in is finding other ways to detect quality and to use redistribution to motivate and not just to make arbitrary connections, but rather to really motivate good work. Okay, So I don't know if I have time for the Cold War stuff. Oh, I haven't gotten. That was pretty fast. So I'll give you this quickly. I don't know if you've heard about this, and it doesn't fit in totally well, but a little bit with what we've just been talking about. But actually, this is really important. How do you solve all these problems? You solve them with governance, right? So governing is literally a problem of selecting, and it's not only governments that do this, incidentally. Every entity has to do this. You have to do this, when you wake up in the morning, companies have to do this, governments do this. But what is governing? You select a problem that you need to work on right now. You use resources, time, money, people, whatever. And then you try to stabilize it, which I actually think this is one of the reasons governance is less doable too, is that it's hard to get people to not notice it. But anyway, that is redistribution. So the question is, can we trust government to do the governing for us? And of course not. No, you don't just trust anyone. Like I just told you, remember that was on a slide. I told you that it's on the quiz. It isn't that we trust an entity that much more powerful than we are. We have to make sure the government works for us, right? Vigilance is a necessary component. It's always useful, though, to have modularity. If we can use government to help, and you should see when I talk to big tech about these kinds of things, it's like, you don't have to figure out how to stop your sector racing to the bottom by yourself. You and your sector can get together and then ask government to do the policing. Google doesn't have to police Apple. They can ask the government to police it. In fact, Facebook is trying this right now. Anyway, ask me to tell you about Nick Clegg at some point. Anyway, so governments are a principal means by which we make it easier to ensure everybody does their fair share, right? That is literally, it is a coordination mechanism that we use, especially in democracies, but everywhere. It is the way that we try to make things work. Okay. So there's a big question, though, about which government, right? And speaking of Facebook, Facebook says openly, apparently, I haven't read the terms and conditions, but my friend and colleague, Dave Gunkel, has, and he made his students do it at least. And apparently they say, any government can ask us for information about their citizens and we just give it to them, any government. So some people are claiming that Europe is just hopeless at this stuff, and that there's a big war going on right now between China and America. It's a binary thing, and Europe has stopped doing things like trying to get redistribution out of big tech. In fact, we should be donating money. I literally, in the Global Partnership for AI, somebody said we need to donate money to Google. Europe should be sending money there to help make sure that we win the AI fight against China. Now, I hope you noticed that calling, so the guy whose name is on the slide, he made the picture at the bottom, but he never put China as Asia, right? Like these places, Samsung, that Korea is not a big fan of China, right? They're actually, they are, and Japan, also there's Japanese companies up there. It's not a very good graph. Anyway, this is all very weird. It's about what do you consider a platform. So with a colleague, actually in the European Commission, Helena Malikova, we chose an arbitrary, but I think you could choose any one if you want, an arbitrary objective criteria. So you had to have at least, any company that had at least 2 patents in the World Patent Organization, the WIPO database, in 2019 in the category that's artificial intelligence. Now, yes, you could change this if you chose some other categories or whatever. It doesn't matter. We were just saying, let's give something a little bit more objective than drawing a bunch of circles on a piece of paper. And incidentally, I could now get, The Economist just did that too. Okay, so what is this graph showing us? The y-axis here, these are logs, that's why it's no zeros. The y-axis here is the number of patents, okay, for these different companies. And the x-axis is the market cap. Okay, so a lot of people treat market cap like it's this, just this ultimate good. It's like just the quality of the company. And one of the things doing this project showed me that I think was super interesting is that no, it's a strategy. And I already knew that going for patents is also a strategy. So IBM plays that game. See, look, Google, IBM. Well, for a long time they were the big monoliths, so they've been playing the game for a long time. But now they're still playing the game because they're trying to get programmers. They're fighting with Google and Microsoft trying to get good programmers, right? But Apple doesn't play that game. Apple is much more interested in privacy for itself too, right? And Facebook is not playing that game here. They're like, why should we tell people about our IP? We don't want them to know. They're not going to use the courts to fight their battles for them, right? So I knew that about IP, but I hadn't thought about how much of it was true about market cap too. But Europe, we basically don't let companies get that big of market cap. The biggest market cap in Europe is actually Switzerland. Look, like Hoffmann La Roche there, right? So there's the market cap is also something that has to do with regulatory strategies of a government. And just tell me that Alibaba and Tencent having the same number of patents and the same amount of market cap is a coincidence, right? We all know they're in a heavily regulated, well, I don't know if you guys all know. They're Chinese companies. Okay, now we can all say that's a heavily regulated country, and apparently they decided to play the market cap game. What is the market cap game? It allows you to speculate on your future expected income to then do things like buy other companies. Basically, it's like a way to get money out of the bank. And so so this is something that you see quite a lot of countries have one company. In fact, the Aramco there is Saudi Arabia just suddenly going out and saying, okay, we've decided to make our oil into a listed company, and we want to make the world think that we do AI, so we're going to go and find a couple of AI patents somewhere, and boom, you get this weird graph. So anyway, take a look at the graph. What's interesting is that it does, that Europe isn't that much worse than China. And I just said that, well, we don't play the market cap game. We don't like our companies getting totally out of control. But look at the rest of the world. Like, the rest of the world is bigger than China and the EEA combined. So this weird binary story about China and America is false. And then also look at the entire rest of the world combined to America. It does not look to me like Google or anybody else in America needs a lot of help with their AI from Europe. Okay, so anyway, that's just a venting of that's a paper that that was under review by a very good place and didn't get in, so we're working on another one. But I just want to mention one of the things that drives me crazy about that entire narrative is that we don't even mention one of the players in the world. So you guys, I can't see what you say. Oh, I can pull out and see what you say. But if I do yet, I'll give away the answer. So what do you think this graph is about? What could it be that's changing GDPs in this way? And I'll give you a clue, it's not AI. Yeah, type some stuff in chat. I want to hear those little plunk noises. That means you guys are guessing. You still there? I can't tell if you're there. Well, somebody's guessed something. Okay. Yeah, come on. Guess a bunch of things and we'll see if you're right later. All right. Okay, good. All right, so the answer is global warming. All right. And yes, I know that America is not in the Paris Accord and Russia is in, but Russia has done nothing for the Paris Accord. So, and I want to remember back to the autonomy thing. What is war? War is dismantling your enemy's infrastructure so they lose autonomy with respect to you. That is literally one of, it's not the only, but it's one of the definitions of war. So we could look at the kinds of things that are happening, destabilizing NATO and the EU and things like that, and say, what are people trying to do? What game are they trying to play? All right, so what should we do as individual programmers? I got this far and I didn't show you one little thing. Let me show you the last thing. Artificial intelligence is something that's intelligent that somebody built, okay? They sat down and they built it, okay? And that implies that there's some responsibility, all right? Now, I know you can put a random number generator in your AI, but you choose to put a random number generator in your AI, all right? So AI is based on top of the digital revolution, a communications revolution. And I think that's the thing that's actually helping increase the inequality right now, right? What a society is and can be is fundamentally altered by how easy it is to communicate information and power. So I think we're going to have to seriously reinvent our governance. We're still going to need governments. Governments are the way we coordinate by geographic location, right? These things about water and air and how much to invest in hospitals are things that we have to coordinate. But things are definitely going to change if we're going to have these kinds of huge shifts, right? So basically the idea is that governance has to be modified as it was in the early 20th century following the wars. We need to figure out now what to do to follow the digital technology revolution. Fortunately, we have a bunch of principles, and I don't think we need to make up more. I think these are a really good consolidation of 10 years of effort. The first primary one is that AI has to benefit people and the planet, a huge point. Sustainability, the Sustainability Development Goals of the UN. Remember that AI is an artifact, right? So is the rule of law. All these laws and governance or whatever, those are also artifacts. They can be changed. But we've spent thousands of years getting to where we are, which works more or less. So we should design AI itself so that we can make it easier to regulate, right? Just straightforward common sense. So there has to be transparency, responsible disclosure around AI systems so that we can tell when we're engaging with them and we can challenge outcomes that come as a consequence of them. AI has to function in a robust and secure and safe way throughout the lifetime of the system. And finally, organizations, individuals developing, deploying, or operating, owners or operators, AI systems have to be held accountable for their proper functioning. So this is the basic ideas, which are human-centered, fair, transparent, safe, and accountable, as we mentioned before. Okay, so when we govern it, as I mentioned, it's a digital artifact. Opaqueness in an artifact is a choice, not a necessity, but I'm not going to say don't use deep learning. No, even opaque AI is still perfectly possible to support accountable transparency. So we aren't regulating the micro details of how AI works, right? We're not saying, you know, what is the weight on your deep learning network doing? What we should be doing is saying, are people building it correctly? Did they test it correctly? Did they follow good practice? Because humans are the ones humans can regulate, okay? So when you architect the system, right? When you build it, you have to sit down and thought and said, what are the components? What input does it have? What outputs, what actuators, what actions can it take? It has to be secured, cyber secured, including logs of the development, logs of what the system does. You need to make sure you don't just download any random software off the software libraries off the web. You need to know that they're secure. You need to know your data libraries haven't been interfered with, right? And then you keep and secure revision control every change to the code base. Who made it? Why? There's all these questions about like, oh, why is it that the system is hurting Black people and overly helping white people? We need to know, is that just a mistake because there's fewer Black people? Or is that actually a deliberate choice by a politician that procured the system? You should be able to tell through things like revision control system when problems were introduced and whether or not known bias problems, for example, were checked for. Yeah, and then finally for running system. Okay, so I mentioned that you obviously you've seen this graph before. That we have this fundamental problem of shrinking numbers of proportionally more powerful actors breeding entropy, and that we think that there's a problem with regulatory capture, which was solved, right? So the Bretton Woods helped us. There was an agreement, yes, it was favoring America and Britain at the time. But anyway, the point is that we came up with sets of rules that helped us, right? And I think we need rules like that, for example, figuring out the digital tax, transnational tax. So thank you. Believe it or not, that's the end.